Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about an HOA that wants access to my barn. I never imagined that moving to a remote mountain retreat would end up causing one of the biggest uproars in my life. When I first discovered the perfect patch of land, it was as if I'd stumbled onto a hidden paradise. Picture towering pine trees, a crisp breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers, and rugged mountain peaks that glowed pink at sunrise. It felt like I'd been handed the key to a secret kingdom, perched on the side of a winding gravel road. I remember the first day I stepped onto that property. The previous owners had built a sturdy barn, complete with high rafters and little windows that let in just enough sunlight to turn dust motes into swirling golden flecks. It was peaceful, private, and I felt safer there than I'd ever felt in my life. For several years after I purchased it, I spent my weekends making small improvements to the barn and the nearby cabin. My plan was never to live there full-time. It was more of a getaway from the noise of the city. The barn, while old-fashioned in some respects, was surprisingly well insulated. On cold winter nights, I'd gather with friends around a makeshift fire pit out back, telling ghost stories beneath a star-speckled sky. During the summer, I'd tinker with the interior of the barn, building shelves to store extra lumber and tools. It was an ongoing passion project, something I plan to enjoy for decades to come. Then, not too long ago, I made the decision to become more than a weekend warrior. The job I held downtown shifted to remote work, and it occurred to me that I could live up in the mountains for a significant portion of the year without sacrificing my career. I'd seen the region in bits and pieces, during short stays basically, but I always had to return to my city apartment come Monday morning. Now I had the freedom to spend weeks at a time enjoying the cooler mountain air, the wildlife that would sometimes wander in, and the absolute tranquility that's hard to find near major highways or urban sprawl. That was the dream. I was living it. Little did I know this dream would soon collide with a group of overreaching individuals who believed they had authority over my private property. In the beginning, I heard rumors about the local homeowners association that operated in the general vicinity. Living on a private mountain property, I never gave them much thought. As far as I knew, the boundary lines for that community association didn't reach my plot. My address was outside their designated range, and when I bought the property, the title company confirmed that there were no HOA fees or restrictions associated with it. I was free as a bird. At least that's what I believed. But then I received my first letter. It was a formal-looking envelope from an entity calling itself the Scenic Vista Community Board. Inside, there was a notice demanding that I attend a mandatory community meeting the following month. The text was oddly intimidating, talking about compliance reviews and enforcement oversight. I was puzzled but decided to attend anyway, mostly out of curiosity. When I arrived at the stated venue, an old community center near the base of the mountain, I was greeted by a handful of individuals who seemed surprised to see me. Their expressions were almost suspicious, as if they hadn't expected me to show up. I sat through an hour of them discussing budget line items, seasonal lawn care rules, and other mundane topics. Occasionally, they tossed around references to view protection guidelines, landscape harmony, and architectural cohesion. I was thoroughly lost. Toward the end, the board president, a stern-looking man named Myron, got up in front of everyone and read a list of properties that, according to him, needed immediate inspection for compliance. As I listened, he called out addresses, some of which sounded vaguely near my area, but not exactly. Then came my surprise. He rattled off my address. My jaw almost hit the floor. When the meeting wrapped up, I introduced myself to Myron and explained that I wasn't actually part of their HOA. Politely but firmly, I told him I had no record of an HOA agreement tied to my land. He gazed at me with this condescending half-smile, the kind that suggests the other person believes they know something you don't. "We've had some territorial expansions," he said, as if that was a legitimate explanation for why they decided to include my property in their roster. He then added, "We expect everyone to abide by the same regulations for the good of the community." After I pressed for more details, he gave me a short, dismissive statement. "You'll hear from us again soon." I walked out of that meeting unsettled. I knew from the start this had the potential to become a mess. However, my nature is to be optimistic, so I tried to reassure myself that maybe they were just confused. My land was originally homesteaded decades ago and had changed hands a few times, but never had it been included in an HOA's domain. As soon as I got home, I double-checked all my documents, closing statements, title insurance, county records. Everything confirmed that I was indeed outside of any association's governance. That should have been the end of it, right? A week later, I found a bright red piece of paper taped to my barn door. It looked like a citation. The document demanded that I grant immediate access to the HOA's compliance officers so they could verify that my barn met approved structural guidelines for external fixtures. My heart pounded in disbelief. How brazen were these people? No one had even knocked on my cabin door to say hello or ask permission. They simply stuck an official-looking demand on my building. There was no contact info except for a general phone number belonging to the HOA's main office. This time, I was annoyed enough to call them. The phone rang, and eventually a secretary answered. She was polite to the point of being dismissive, which only fueled my frustration. She insisted that all properties, even ones historically classified as out of bounds, were now under the umbrella of the Scenic Vista Community Board. She repeated the same lines. It's for uniformity. It's for communal standards. Whenever I asked for legal proof, she'd say something like, "That's for our legal team to decide," or "Compliance is mandatory." No matter how many times I stated that I was not and never had been part of their association, she wouldn't budge. At that point, I started to worry that someone might try trespassing or messing with my barn in my absence. After all, I only stayed up there a few weeks at a time. What if they thought they had the right to barge in and start imposing their will? I put up a small security camera, the solar-powered kind that can send an alert to my phone. I also posted a polite but firm sign on my gate, which read, "Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." It seemed like a basic step in protecting my rights. As it turned out, it was also the first step in an escalating war. About a month passed quietly. Maybe they realized they had no real jurisdiction and gave up, or so I hoped. Then, on a chilly fall morning, right as golden leaves were carpeting the forest floor, I decided to drive back to the city for a couple of days to handle errands. When I returned, I discovered footprints around my barn, large boot impressions in the mud. It had rained while I was gone, so the evidence was fresh. It appeared that people had walked around the entire perimeter, and at one point, they'd even tried to look in the windows. They left behind scraps of paper stapled to my barn's wooden siding. More demands threatening fines for non-compliance. I was beyond livid. What gave them the right to come onto my property without my permission? I'd never in my life signed any document consenting to the Scenic Vista Community Board's oversight. Immediately, I started calling local authorities to find out what I could do. The sheriff's office told me to file a report for trespassing. They advised me that if the individuals came again without my permission, I should call 911. They made it clear that private property owners in our state had the right to refuse unauthorized entry, especially from an HOA that had no legitimate claim over the property. On a whim, I reached out to a local attorney who specialized in property disputes. He confirmed my suspicion. If I was never a member of the HOA, they had no right to impose new terms on me retroactively. He suggested I send a cease and desist letter to the HOA, which I did. I typed it up with the help of the attorney, mailed it via certified mail, and included copies of my property records. I thought that would settle the matter. How naive I was. A few weeks later, something truly bizarre happened. I was outside unloading a few sacks of feed for my old pony, King, who occasionally roams the enclosed pasture. Suddenly, I see a convoy of cars, 3 SUVs and a sedan, pull up to my gate. About half a dozen people got out, including Myron, the board president. I'd only talked to him that one time in person. He was flanked by several other board members I recognized from the meeting, plus one man who was apparently some sort of compliance inspector. They were dressed like city slickers trying to hike a mountain for the first time. Expensive boots, brand new jackets, and a sense of self-importance that practically radiated off them. Myron barked orders at me, demanding I open the gate so they could inspect the barn for communal standard violations. The gall of this man left me speechless for a moment. When I caught my breath, I told them that they had absolutely no right to be on my land. I said, "Leave now or I'm calling the authorities," but Myron just scoffed. He claimed the board had a right to ensure that all structures within their newly expanded territory followed the uniform aesthetic guidelines. He threatened me, saying if I didn't cooperate, they would take drastic measures to gain entry. That's when my patience hit its breaking point. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. As soon as the operator picked up, I explained that a group of people were trespassing on my land and refusing to leave. The operator calmly assured me that a patrol car would be dispatched. Myron must have heard me repeating my address, because his smug grin faltered. Still, he glared at me and insisted that it was within his authority to be there. His entourage looked less certain. One woman kept adjusting her glasses nervously, while another man scuffed his boots in the dirt like he was trying to decide whether to speak up. When the local sheriff's deputy arrived, she made it in decent time considering the mountainous roads. She was professional, but firm. She asked Myron and his group what they were doing. Myron launched into a pompous tirade about how they represented the Scenic Vista Community Board and had the right to inspect any property within a certain radius. The deputy shut him down politely. She asked to see any legal documentation that proved they had dominion over my land. Myron fumbled. He tried to wave around a folder filled with papers, but none of them bore my signature or any official county stamp that would indicate an expansion of territory. The deputy turned to me, asked if I was the property owner, and when I said yes, she looked back at Myron. "If the property owner is not part of your association and you can't prove otherwise, you have no authority here," she said in a firm tone. Myron's face went purple. He still tried to argue, but the deputy told him that in our state, trespassing on private property without permission could lead to immediate charges. She gave him the option to leave or face a citation. Reluctantly, Myron and his group slunk away, mumbling about how this wasn't over. As they piled back into their vehicles, I could see the anger etched on their faces. The deputy asked me if I wanted to file an official complaint. I decided to do so, mostly to have a record of the incident in case they tried anything else. She took my statement, and before she left, she gave me her card and suggested that if they returned without a court order, I should call again. That night, as I sat in my cabin, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this was far from resolved. My attorney friend told me that such HOAs can't just extend their territory arbitrarily, but that doesn't always stop them from attempting to bully people into compliance. And that's exactly how it felt, like bullying. They were counting on me not knowing the law or not wanting the hassle of resisting them. My guess was they had some bigger plan in mind. Maybe they wanted to force my land into their association so they could collect fees or control the usage. Whatever the reason, they'd picked the wrong person to harass. Around this time, I discovered that the Scenic Vista Community Board had a shady history of pressuring smaller property owners to join. I learned this from a neighbor, Gideon, who lived a few miles down the mountain. Gideon told me over coffee one morning that he'd once considered buying a plot in the same area, but had run into nonsense with the same HOA. He managed to dodge it by purchasing land from a different section altogether. He described Myron as a ruthless opportunist who liked to flex the rules whenever possible. Gideon suspected that Myron was angling to turn the entire region into some cohesive development, presumably for personal profit or a power trip. With Gideon's insight, I felt more prepared. For several weeks, I kept a close eye on my security cameras and made sure not to leave the property unattended for too long. Work was a bit challenging because I had to juggle my responsibilities while looking out for any signs of trespassers. My friend Tasha even came up for a few days to help me keep watch. Nothing out of the ordinary happened during that time. It was quiet. Eerily so, in fact, and I wondered if maybe the scare from local law enforcement had put an end to their intimidation attempts. But I was wrong. The lull was just the calm before a storm. One overcast afternoon, I was taking a break from Zoom calls and happened to glance out the window. Lo and behold, 3 men wearing reflective vests were walking around the perimeter of my barn. They hadn't bothered to come to the cabin door to announce themselves. They were measuring something, making notes on clipboards. My adrenaline spiked. I grabbed my phone and rushed outside, calling out, "Hey, this is private property!" None of them looked particularly alarmed. One man, who looked like he was in his 50s, just waved a piece of paper at me as though that gave them permission. I repeated my warning. They needed to leave immediately. They claimed they were authorized inspectors, but when I asked who authorized them, they mumbled something about the Scenic Vista Board. I told them I would call the sheriff if they didn't exit my land. 2 of them looked uneasy, but the older man insisted, "We have the right to be here." Well, that was enough for me. I dialed 911 again and explained the situation. While waiting for a deputy to arrive, I took pictures of them on my phone for evidence. They glared at me, but they didn't leave. Instead, they started snapping their own photos, pointing at the barn's roof, the old tractor in the field, and even my pony trotting around near the fence. It felt invasive and downright creepy. When a deputy arrived, this time a different officer from the same sheriff's department, He took one look at the men and asked them for identification. They provided driver's licenses but had no official documentation proving any right to be on my land. The deputy told them to leave. They tried to argue, but they didn't get far. The officer warned that if they didn't vacate, he'd arrest them for trespassing. That worked like a charm. They hurried off, their measuring tapes dragging across the gravel. The deputy advised me to follow up with legal action if this continued, which I planned to do. He noted the incident on record, and once again, I was left on my property, heart pounding at the audacity of these people. In the days that followed, I felt torn between fear and anger. Fear that these intrusions would keep happening, and anger that I even had to fear in the first place. I wasn't violating any laws. My barn was fully up to local code, and my land was lawfully not under HOA governance. Yet I was forced to repeatedly chase away strangers who believed they could bully me into submission. That's when I decided to hire a lawyer more formally. Enough was enough. I needed a court order, some sort of legal document that stated unequivocally that the Scenic Vista Community Board had zero authority over me. While my lawyer started drafting the necessary paperwork, I learned of another fiasco. Apparently, Scenic Vista had sent out letters to other homeowners, stating that I, referred to as the occupant of the large barn near the ridge, was in violation of multiple aesthetic guidelines. This letter was used as an example to show how the board was cracking down on renegade properties. It read like propaganda, implying that I was an outlaw who refused to maintain the visual harmony of the area. This further stoked the flames of neighborly gossip. Suddenly, a handful of local folks who might have had no interest in this conflict started viewing me as the villain. I got a couple of calls from acquaintances asking if I was planning to hide something dangerous in that old barn, or if I was building an unsightly addition. The rumors were baseless, of course, but rumors can spread fast in small communities. When I discovered that the HOA was actively defaming me, I called my attorney in a rage. He agreed that this crossed a line. Not only were they trespassing, but they were also publicly smearing me and misrepresenting my property. We decided that in addition to filing a restraining order against unauthorized entries, we would also consider a defamation claim if they didn't stop. So, my lawyer sent a strongly worded letter to the HOA's legal department, demanding an immediate cease and desist regarding their false statements about my barn. That seemed to get their attention. They finally responded through some official legal counsel, who claimed they had documentation of the HOA's right to oversee my land. However, when pressed, they only produced maps that were not updated or lacked official county seals, none of which established any legitimate claim. Their counsel also tried to argue that because I was using the same access road as some of their residents, I was subject to HOA regulations. My own attorney quickly shut that down by pointing to county records showing that the road was county-maintained, not a private HOA road. It was a flimsy argument at best. Yet, the HOA still wouldn't relent. It was like dealing with a stubborn child who refused to admit they were wrong. At some point, I realized Myron wasn't acting out of confusion. He was acting out of deliberate obstinacy and arrogance. He wanted control of every property in the region, possibly to boost the HOA's revenue or his personal ego, and I was an obstacle that needed to be removed or subdued. But I wasn't about to let that happen. My chance for a more definitive confrontation arrived when I least expected it. Late one afternoon, I caught sight of a vehicle creeping up my driveway. This time, it wasn't an SUV plastered with HOA stickers or a cluster of suspicious compliance officers. It was just one car, and out stepped a frazzled-looking middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Carla, a representative from the Scenic Vista Board. She claimed she had come to talk things out in a civil manner. I was wary, but I offered her a seat outside by my fire pit. I wasn't about to let her into my cabin. Over a cup of coffee, she insisted that the entire fiasco was a misunderstanding. According to Carla, the board had updated boundary lines in good faith and truly believed that my land was included. However, she also admitted that Myron had been pushing the boundaries for a while, and some of the board members were growing uncomfortable with his tactics. My sympathy for Carla was limited. She seemed like a decent person stuck in a bad situation, but she also kept stressing that I needed to compromise. I asked her, "Compromise on what? My legal rights? My private property? Do you realize how ridiculous that sounds?" Her responses were vague. She hinted that if I allowed an inspection and paid a small annual fee, they would leave me alone. That was basically extortion in my eyes. I told her that was not going to happen and that if the HOA continued to trespass or defame me, I would proceed with every legal avenue available. The conversation ended with Carla looking disappointed, but I walked away with the impression that the board was feeling some internal pressure. Maybe their members weren't unanimously supporting Myron's extreme approach. The next day, I got a call from my lawyer. We'd been granted a hearing for a restraining order against the HOA's unauthorized inspections. This was a big step. If a judge granted the order, it would be illegal for them to even set foot on my land without facing significant legal repercussions. I was hopeful, but also anxious. Going to court is never a pleasant experience, and the thought of it made me uneasy. However, I knew it was the right thing to do. In the days leading up to the hearing, tension in the area seemed to rise. I heard from Gideon that Myron was fuming about how I'd dragged the community into a lawsuit. My reaction was that he had dragged himself into this by overreaching in the first place. I also heard rumors that some Scenic Vista residents were pushing for Myron to step down as president. Apparently, many folks didn't appreciate his heavy-handed ways, which had brought negative attention to the association. At the hearing, Myron showed up wearing a suit and carrying a thick binder of documents, most of which seemed irrelevant. He rambled on about how I was detrimental to the community's aesthetic standards and that my barn was an eyesore. I nearly snorted in disbelief. My barn is a classic rustic structure with no peeling paint or hazards. In fact, many of my neighbors have told me how charming it looks, nestled among the pines. Myron was grasping at straws. My attorney presented clear evidence: the property deeds, the county assessor's maps, and the fact that Scenic Vista had zero legal basis to claim me. The judge looked unimpressed with Myron's arguments. Ultimately, the judge ruled in my favor. She granted a restraining order preventing the Scenic Vista Community Board or its agents from setting foot on my land without my explicit permission or a court order. If they tried, I could call law enforcement and they'd be subject to penalties. As for Myron's claims that the barn violated some intangible guidelines, the judge succinctly stated that it was not her concern, as no such guidelines could be enforced on a property outside the HOA's jurisdiction. The final blow came when my attorney brought up the repeated incidents of trespass, in defiance of my posted signs and repeated warnings. The judge made it clear that continuing such behavior would result in legal consequences. Myron left the courtroom looking like he'd swallowed a lemon. His so-called victory had turned into a defeat, and as I was walking out, one of the board members who was present actually apologized to me. She said she was sorry it had gone this far and that not everyone on the board agreed with Myron. I thanked her for the sentiment, but I was still shaken by the entire ordeal. In the following weeks, I received confirmation from the county that no official expansions of Scenic Vista territory had been approved. The board might have tried to apply for expansions, but nothing had been granted. I also started hearing through the grapevine that Myron was facing significant backlash from within the association. Some of the residents were furious about the legal costs incurred by the board's antics. Others were simply embarrassed. A special meeting was held and Myron was voted out as president. I can't say I was surprised, but that wasn't the end of Myron's troubles. I later heard that the county sheriff's office was investigating potential harassment claims by multiple property owners. My incident was just one among several. Apparently, Myron had orchestrated similar attempts to annex other plots of land. Some folks had caved under the pressure, possibly paying fees to keep the HOA off their backs. Now that my case had gone public, it emboldened others to come forward, revealing the extent of Myron's overreach. The possibility of criminal charges was on the table, or at least a civil lawsuit from the people who felt extorted. Although I wasn't directly involved in that aspect, I secretly hoped he'd get a good dose of accountability. With Myron dethroned and the restraining order in place, my life finally returned to a sense of normalcy. The winter snow fell across the mountains, covering the barn roof in a pristine blanket. I'd stand at my cabin window, sipping hot cocoa, relieved that I no longer had to worry about uninvited trespassers scurrying around with clipboards. King, my pony, trotted around as if he had the entire mountain to himself, which he sort of did. Meanwhile, I made small improvements to the barn interior. I even installed a couple of motion sensor lights outside, just in case. You can never be too cautious when you've had neighbors like that HOA. A few months after the dust settled, Gideon and Tasha came over to celebrate. We grilled burgers by the fire pit and joked about the time I had to call 911 on the HOA infiltration squad. We laughed, but we also knew it had been a real threat. If I hadn't stood my ground, that barn could have ended up under the HOA's intrusive control. The entire fiasco taught me a valuable lesson. Never take your property rights for granted, and always be ready to defend them when bullies come knocking. I still receive the occasional letter from Scenic Vista, but now they're just generic announcements or invitations to community events. I imagine I'm on some automated mailing list, but not once have they mentioned an inspection or demanded any fees. They know better at this point. Every now and then I'll see Carla's name on one of those invitations, signing off as acting board president, so presumably she took Myron's spot. She never showed up at my gate again, and I have no desire to attend their events. As far as I'm concerned, they can hold their pancake breakfasts and craft fairs without me. My barn and I will remain happily outside their grasp. In the end, Myron's punishment was both legal and social. He lost his powerful position, faced the embarrassment of a judge's ruling against him, and became the subject of multiple complaints and possibly a lawsuit. The new board leadership seems more cautious, likely not wanting to follow his footsteps. If anything, the fiasco made them realize that private property lines exist for a reason, and you can't just redraw them at will. And as for me, I found a renewed sense of respect for the importance of legal paperwork, boundary lines, and having good neighbors who back you up when you need it. Life in the mountains continues. The sound of the wind through the tall pines is still music to my ears, and the barn stands proud, a testament to what I had to do to protect it. Every time I latch the barn door and see the fading marks where their notices once were, I'm reminded of how close I came to losing my privacy, but I didn't, and that's something I'll always be thankful for. I imagine there are other property owners out there who might face similar battles. If there's any parting wisdom I can offer, it's this: do your research, know your rights, and don't be intimidated by a stack of official-looking papers. Bullies rely on fear and confusion to get their way. Arm yourself with knowledge and the support of good counsel, and you'll find that their threats often crumble under scrutiny. Of course, not every case will mirror mine, but I hope that by holding the line, I've set an example in my little corner of the mountains. Friends, thank you. See you soon.